All right, so we wanted to try to demo the clock component that we were talking about in terms of component state and life cycle events, and comparing functional components versus class components, the stateless component versus the stateful component. So here we have that clock, or we're gonna build a clock component. But right now, we in this example we have one function. It's not really even a component yet. It's just a function. And inside of that function, we call it tick. Inside of that tick, we have an element, and the element is just that JSX. It's just some markup of HTML JavaScript. And all it's doing is it's going to go through, and when it renders, it's going to render the JSX. It's going to create that React element for each piece of each piece of HTML, or each piece of the DOM tree. And then it's going to go through and it's going to evaluate. Using the evaluation here, it's going to evaluate new date to the local time string, and it's going to render that. And inside of this function tick, we have the React DOM, and we're calling render on it, and we're passing in this element, and it's going to mount it inside of the root element of the page. And to orchestrate all that, we have a JavaScript set interval function that actually on every second will call this tick. So really, this element is really the clock. So we could actually rename it clock, and it's going to render the clock element on every 1 second. But we don't want that. We want to try to convert this function into a more usable component. So we would have to do a few changes. So we would have to create a clock function, and probably move this piece out of it and call it from the outside. So the next step, this is what it looks like. We have moved the render of the UI for the clock into its own function called clock. So this now is a clock component. And so we refactored a bit to make clock more reusable and encapsulated, so that we can actually use this clock throughout the application if needed. And right now we're passing in a date externally. So we're using React's props properties to do that. So this function will take props, and the props will be a date, and then we can access inside of the JSX by going props.date, and then we call the local time string on it. And when React evaluates this, it'll know to look at the properties, get the date, and try and convert it. And we call this inside of this function tick. So we still have the function tick from previously, and now we have the render inside of that. But instead of the element here that we had this element, now it's going to call the React functional component called clock, and it's going to pass as an attribute date. It's going to be smart enough to map that to the properties, and it's going to pass in the new date, the current date and time. But now, instead of clock is triggered from tick, but tick is still being orchestrated from the outside, and it's still triggering externally in this external set interval. On every second, it's going to call tick. It's going to re-render. It's going to call clock. Clock's going to go through and show the current date and time. Until the next second, it's going to keep going and keep going and keep going until we unmount it. Well, actually, we can't even talk about unmounting. Right now, it's going to go forever until we stop it. So this is not ideal. We would like to have a clock component that is not triggered externally, that keeps track of its own ticking and keeps track of its own time. So that's where we want to go with it. So we can refactor this a little bit further. We can refactor this thing into a class component. So now we use the ES syntax. So we use class right here, and we use the extend keyword from React.component. And what React.component is it's a class that when you extend it, you basically get by default all of the base classes methods, right? So inside of React.component, there's a whole bunch of methods that you can override or tie into, such as the render method right here. So render will be called every time that there's an update to state, and we're going to talk about state in a little bit. You'll get such things as life cycle methods, and you'll get some things related to state and a whole bunch of other things. So it's a way of kind of powering up your components by using this class component syntax. So what we did is we removed the functional component and we converted it into a class component, and now we have a render method. And inside of the render method here, we have to put our JSX and return it. We still have the props.date, but now we use this keyword because when we have an instance of a class, each instance has this keyword, and this internally means this instance, right? If you have multiple instances, this instance is the one you're working with, and it knows all about its own private attributes and state. So again, if we have this function tick, that hasn't really changed at all. We're still passing in the date as a property, and it knows enough that this dot date will be that current time. And we are still externally calling this, and we have one instance of the class, and therefore it's not ticking anymore after that. So if you notice, it is actually ticking, and we're still calling it externally. But we don't want that. We would like for clock to trigger its own ticks. So in order to do that, we now try to add state to the class, and that's what I was saying is it only calls itself once. This is the example where the clock is now static, right? Because we made a few changes here, and the changes where we got rid of that timer, external timer. We don't need that anymore. And we also got rid of the date prop. So now we don't have the date prop. We just render clock. And inside of clock now is going to set up its own state. So what it does is when we're extending this React.component, we should have done this in the previous example, always call constructor and props, and then call the super props, which is the base class constructor, and passing props to it. We should have done that in the previous example. It's always a good pattern to do that, but we didn't do it in the previous example. But now that we know we have this constructor, the reason why we're using the constructor more now is because right here we are defaulting and assigning the state of the class in the class constructor. So this dot state, meaning this state of the clock instance, and we're going to set it to the current time. We're going to set a property called date, and we're going to set it to the current time. And then we're going to go and render it. So when we go through this render method, it's going to go through this JSX, and it's going to evaluate this dot state, which is different from this dot prop. So this dot state dot date. So it's going to go up here, and it's going to look at this, and it's going to render it, and that's what we get over here. But if you notice now, we have no mechanism to trigger it every second. So we have no mechanism to update state and to re-render the component with the current time and keep ticking, right? So we need a way to trigger that. We need a way internally to trigger the ticks inside of a component. So what we need to do is we need to tie into React.components lifecycle events. And when we tie into the lifecycle events such as component will mount when the component is first displayed in UI, component will update when the component's been updated, when component unmounts, when it unmounts when it kind of removes itself from the UI. Maybe somebody's routing somewhere to another page, changing pages, and the components all change. That means the class is being destroyed. That means we need to do some cleanup. So we need to tie into the lifecycle to make this clock work, and that's the last thing here. A little bit more code. Now we see that the time is ticking, and what we did here is same thing, we still initialize state, but right now we add these methods here. So we have component did mount, and we have component will unmount. So we have those two. So basically when it first mounts and when it unmounts. So the first time it mounts in the DOM, it's rendered, we go through and we set this set interval. So we kick off an interval. So every single interval, every second, it's going to go through and it's going to call this dot tick, which is a function internally inside of the clock component. And what this function does is it's going to update state. So every time that it updates states, it's going to update this current state and set the current date and time. And React will be smart enough to pick up that update It's going to call the render DOM method, and it's going to do the reconciliation, the true reconciliation. DOM's going to, in its virtual DOM, is going to be smart enough to just render the clock component in the tree of the HTML DOM tree. So therefore, it's going to keep ticking. So every time state updates, it's going to kickstart, and it's going to re-render this piece, and then it's going to set. This is not going to be loaded. It's not going to be mounted again because it's smart enough to know it's already mounted. It's just updating state and calling the re-rendering. It's just going to keep ticking. It's going to keep calling this render method here. It's going to output this dot state, the current state, and the date of that. And when we unmount the component, meaning when we leave this page, it's going to do some cleanup. It's going to clear that timer. The timer meaning this dot timer ID that we set when we kicked off this thing. And if you look at when we render it, we just call it once. So when React DOM loads, it renders the clock component, and then the clock component kicks off this whole cycle. And now we have a component that calls itself, manages its own state, and uses lifestyle methods to basically create a self-contained timer and a very useful component that now we can reuse throughout our application.